Cellular respiration is the process through which cells of your body burn glucose to get ATP energy. Before we really talk about the steps of cellular respiration and the processes involved, it's worth taking a minute to think about how the glucose we're going to burn gets to the different cells of our body, and then what those cells do to make sure that glucose stays there once they absorb it. We all remember our three water compartments. Anytime we consume a meal that has carbohydrates in it, blood glucose levels are going to increase. We can talk about that process later on in the digestive system. As blood glucose levels increase, as blood is delivered to tissues all over the body, that glucose is going to diffuse from the blood into the interstitial fluid. As we talk about how glucose enters the cells of your body, we're going to focus on three major organs, tissues, types of cells. The cells of the liver, the cells that make up your skeletal muscles, like the bicep brachii, the rectus femoris, the gluteus maximus, and the good old-fashioned fat cell. Now, basically, fat cells and skeletal muscle cells are going to do these processes with respect to glucose and cellular respiration the same way. So I'll basically just talk about skeletal muscle. The liver is the real outlier here. Anytime we wind up delivering glucose to the interstitial fluid around the cells of the liver or skeletal muscle or adipose cells, that glucose can then diffuse into cells. And we'll specifically talk about that process in a second. Once in muscle cells or adipocytes, fat cells, that glucose is trapped. It's never getting out. It is destined to eventually be broken down through cellular respiration. Liver cells, however, have the ability to release that glucose back into the interstitial fluid, back into the blood, because one of the major roles of the liver is to, well, regulate blood glucose levels. So the real takeaway so far is simply recalling the body's three water compartments and how glucose that winds up in the blood following a meal gets delivered to all the tissues of all the organs all over the body. And then understanding that once the liver absorbs glucose, it's able to hang on to it, store it for a while, and then release it later to help increase blood glucose levels if that becomes necessary. In skeletal muscle cells or fat cells, once glucose enters the cell, that's it. It's not going anywhere. We zoomed in a little bit just to have a better feel for what's going on at the cellular level. Now keep in mind, blood is out here, interstitial fluid. We have what we're going to call a muscle fiber or a muscle cell, and in there we put some mitochondria just so we can keep things in place in our heads as we talk about the steps of cellular respiration. But before we get to that, we need to keep in mind that glucose has to get into the cell. It got to the interstitial fluid through the bloodstream, the plasma of the blood. And as long as glucose levels in the blood are higher than glucose levels in the interstitial fluid, glucose is going to diffuse into the interstitial fluid. In our little cartoon cell world, we have cell membrane outside the cell, cytosol of the cell, mitochondria that we're going to discuss later on. And we'll notice that the concentration of glucose is greater outside the cell than in the cytosol. That means glucose wants to diffuse into the cell. Glucose can't cross the cell membrane by itself, but with the help of the GLUT4 transport protein, glucose is going to be able to whoopity-whoop, enter the cell. Whoopity-whoop, enter the cell. If it wasn't for the GLUT4 transport protein, glucose wouldn't be able to enter the cell. It would be trapped. Now, a couple things have to happen. One, once this glucose is in the cell, we don't want it to be able to get back out of the cell. We need to trap that glucose in this skeletal muscle cell. And we're going to do that with the help of ATP and the enzyme hexokinase. Hexokinase is found in every cell of your body. And hexokinase is going to be involved in turning glucose into this molecule, glucose 6-phosphate. Liver cells have glucokinase as well. It does the same thing, but it's only found in liver cells, and we should be aware that liver cells have glucokinase in addition to hexokinase. Once the glucose has entered the cell, hexokinase is going to combine glucose with ATP. It's going to remove one of the phosphates from the ATP, stick it on the glucose, and we now have glucose 6-phosphate. That's done two things for us. One of the things that it's done is glucose 6-phosphate isn't glucose, and its shape isn't going to be recognized by the GLUT4 transporter anymore. That means it's trapped. By turning glucose into glucose 6-phosphate, that passage that glucose has to get across the membrane is gone. And now that glucose is trapped, it's never going to leave the cell. Ultimately, it's going to wind up burned in cellular respiration. The other thing it does is, since glucose 6-phosphate isn't glucose, we maintain the concentration gradient where there's more glucose outside the cell and less glucose inside the cell, because that's not glucose, it's glucose 6-phosphate. And we're maintaining that concentration gradient. If the cell is being metabolically active, if the muscle fiber is contracting, using ATP energy, that glucose 6-phosphate is going to head directly into glycolysis. However, if the muscle fiber isn't doing anything, if we're not using any ATP energy, there's no point in making more ATP. Once you fill your gas tank, you can't fill it anymore, right? The gas tank holds 15 gallons. Once you put 15 gallons in it, you can't put any more gas in it until you burn some of that gas. If a muscle cell is just sitting around and it hasn't been burning any ATP, we've filled it up with ATP. We can't fill it anymore. We need to store this glucose to use it later on when we're going to need to make more ATP. We're going to do that through the action of a couple of enzymes. We don't need to worry about the names of these enzymes, but these enzymes are basically going to add the glucose 6-phosphate onto a glycogen. Glycogen is the polysaccharide that your body cells use to store glucose. Muscle cells, they love to store extra glucose away as the polysaccharide glycogen. So as soon as that glucose 6-phosphate shows up, it's trapped in the cell, we're not really doing anything metabolically, we're full of ATP. Let's use a couple of enzymes, don't worry about the names, to essentially stitch that new glucose onto the glycogen. Yeah, this is only 4. Glucose is big. In reality, glycogen is going to be thousands upon thousands upon thousands of glucose is big. And it's not a straight line. It's going to have lots and lots of branches. But later on, when we don't have glucose entering the cell anymore, we're becoming more metabolically active, we need to make some more ATP, then we can start to pull those glucoses off of the glycogen as glucose 6-phosphate, and that glucose 6-phosphate can then enter the first step of cellular respiration, glycolysis.